The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
My mother saved these letters, all the negative opinions, where most people might have crumpled them up or burned them or felt upset by them. My mother viewed these as important documents for posterity.
Then, later on The Agenda.
Clara has been treated as an eccentric or possibly insane woman who had a very good lawyer and thus got away with murder.
Also tonight.
This basically is our gray water system.
An earthship may look like something out of this world, but it actually has a lot to do with planet Earth.
Sheila White's parents proved that love conquers. Okay, maybe not all, but a lot. The evidence of just how much they had to overcome is detailed in her new book. It's called The Letters, Postmark Prejudice in Black and White. It chronicles the family and societal opposition the mixed-race couple faced in the post-World War II era and beyond. And Sheila White joins us now. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much, Jan. Nice to be here.
Now let's start it off. Let's get to know your parents. We have a photo of them. This is from their wedding day. Tell us a little bit about them.
Well, let's start with Bill White. In my book, he's called Billy. That was his name back then. And Billy White was born in Truro in 1915 to a very famous Reverend father, Reverend William Andrew White. Actually, his full title was Reverend Captain Dr. William Andrew White. He's a person of federal historical significance. Billy himself was a teacher. He was a social worker. At the time of the book, he is the boys programming director at the YMCA in Halifax. He was also a musician. His whole family had incredible musical talent thanks to his mother, Isidora White, who was born in a small Nova Scotia village called Mill Village and had incredible musical talent. Her background was black, white, and Mi'kmaq, and somehow she learned how to read music, had a gorgeous voice, and taught all her children the skills of music. And one of those children rose to become very prominent in the figure of Portia White, who's an internationally acclaimed concert artist who broke color barriers in the 1940s. So the whole family had contributions to make in the community, and Billy was very much respected and revered among his peers, and multi-talented. Now Vivian, a nice white girl from Dartmouth, a good Baptist. She was involved in the Baptist Young People's Union and the CGIT. She had many friends in the Dartmouth High School, and as a little girl, she created her own newsletter called the Okie Dokie News. Her family, the Keelers, were greenhouse gardeners and prominent in the community. And they were also missionaries. Some of the Keelers women became missionaries in India. And her maternal side, the Harlows, were prominent in North Brookfield, Nova Scotia. They descended from Mayflower pilgrims. They were deeded grand swaths of land on Lake Tupper in North Brookfield. My mother's grandfather was the postmaster of North Brookfield for 42 years. He owned a general store, and he was a farmer who kept a diary for 67 years. And those diaries are now housed in a museum because they are so detailed about early life. So both sides of the family had pillars of the community. The only difference was their skin color.
I do want to actually come back to your paternal grandparents. We have some photos of your grandfather. I want you to describe what we're looking at right here in this photo.
Well, there is Reverend Captain William Andrew White. That photo was taken in around 1917 as he was the honorary captain to the Black Battalion, known as the No. 2 Construction Battalion. It was Canada's only black military unit. It was a labor unit, and it was a unit that the black community had to lobby to have them allowed to participate in the First World War. So my grandfather was a chaplain, and he was chaplain to the troops, and he too kept a diary, which was then made into a film about his career over there. So this is one of the reasons why he was named as someone of historical significance. Also the fact that he organized a number of Baptist churches throughout Nova Scotia, rose to the position of moderator of the Northeastern Baptist Convention, was the minister at the then Cornwallis Street, now known as the New Horizons Baptist Church, which is the mother church of Halifax for the Black community. And he was just involved in every respect of community life, finding jobs for young men who couldn't get jobs, lobbying for food for people who were hungry, this type of thing. So a community leader through and through.
I want to throw up one more photo up there, and this is of Portia White. Tell us a little bit about her. You mentioned, you know, a world-renowned, well-known singer as well, and so that's what we're looking at here.
Yes. Well, this was in her early days of her career when she was winning every musical competition going in Nova Scotia. In fact, she won the musical competition provincially so many times they just told her to keep the silver cup. It's yours. You might as well just keep it forever. That's now housed in the Black Cultural Centre for Nova Scotia, along with many other items pertaining to Portia's career that the family donated. So she began her career in around 1940 and was the first Black to shatter the color barrier and perform and gain international acclaim, including performances for royalty, tours around the world. As a Black woman in the 1940s, she was the first. And coincidentally, and a wonderful piece of news, is that the Canadian Opera Company will be staging an opera about Portia's life, June 14th to 16th here in Toronto. So that's, you know, another notch. Portia, too, is named as a person of historical significance, has appeared on a postage stamp, and has many buildings named after her.
All right, let's talk about shattering these barriers, but I want you to help set the stage. What were the attitudes towards Black people in the 1940s?
Well, there was no mixing. Clearly, it was a racist society because the white constructs of the day believed that white people were in charge and setting the rules, and those other groups would be marginalized, including Indigenous peoples. So the conditions for Blacks was pretty dire because they could not advance to the level of their ability. They were pushed into jobs that were subservient jobs. And I think this is a well-known story, how the only jobs available for men were laborers or porters for the CN Railway. In fact, my Uncle Jack, Bill's brother, was the first Black to shatter that barrier, and he got a job with the CN in the car department. He was the first person to get a job other than in the porter department, and he quickly became the union steward, and there will be a Toronto Heritage plaque unveiled to him for being the first Black steward in North America for any union.
All right. Now, Vivian and Billy had a 10-year age difference. He was divorced. She had a fiance and he a girlfriend. He was Black, she was white. And as you laid out from the 1940s, all of those were difficult circumstances to overcome, weren't they?
Yes, it was complicated. And imagine your daughter coming home in the 1940s and saying, I'm in love with a man, he's divorced. And your mother's a devout Baptist, so stop right there.
Right.
That would be a no-go. Now you add on the layer that, oh, and he's 10 years older. Well, that's not going to be too good. But then you play the race card, and that is just going to be it's going to be a non-starter. It's not going to happen in terms of Vivian's mother, Jean's opinion. My grandmother did not want us to be born. She did not want this marriage to happen, and she orchestrated quite a campaign of letter writing amongst community members to convince Vivian that marrying a Black person would be a dire activity.
All right, let's talk about those letters, because those letters to your mother form the basis of this story, but you wrote it as a novel. Tell me a little bit about that and why that decision.
My mother saved these letters, all the negative opinions, where most people might have crumpled them up or burned them or felt upset by them. My mother viewed these as important documents for posterity, that these attitudes had to be kept and then examined later on. So that was part of my mission, was to give life to these letters, but I didn't know everything.
Right.
I didn't ask my father about his girlfriends in the 1940s. I didn't ask questions about how they met or how my grandmother found out about the relationship. So those are details I had to fictionalize. But largely, my novel is based on nonfiction events and history.
All right, let's talk about the journey of your mother and father. They ultimately decided to travel west and relocated to Toronto. What was their experience there, and how was it vastly different from the East Coast to the big city?
The reason my father came to Toronto was because he had a new job at a community center on Bathurst Street called the Home Service Association, which predominantly served the Black community, which the City of Toronto did a terrible job of serving the welfare needs of that community at the time. And Vivian followed him rather reluctantly to Toronto. She was not convinced that this would be a good move for her. But when they got here, she realized how much freedom they had to do what they wanted to do, to go where they wanted to go, to be embraced by a community, a diverse community, a welcoming community in Toronto. And that's the exciting part about this novel, the positive aspects of the city of Toronto and the climate that my parents found here that enabled them to do some work around race relations and building the bridges and providing the example of how interracial marriage could work.
Let's talk a little bit about that. They worked on a handbook for dealing with racial prejudice. Was this work, did they feel like they had to do this work? Like, tell me a little bit about the need and the want, because that was a huge part of the work that your dad came down here for, but was really what defined sort of a lot of the work that they did when they got here.
Yeah, and it's the kind of work that earned him the Order of Canada Medal and all the other accolades he got through his life. This book that you're talking about was a program annual. It was a guidebook for the United Church Youth of Canada. And how that came about was a reverend named Alvin Cooper would contact the thought leaders of the day and ask them to contribute articles around civics and finances and human relations. And my father was one of the people who was approached because of his role as the programming director at the Home Service Association. And his article was called Pardon Me, Your Prejudice is Showing. And what it is really, what I like to say is, and I haven't found an example to contradict me, this was the first actual race relations program outline, a guidebook for leaders to have conversations about race. And he and my mother took this course outline and implemented it in church basements, at fireside chats in churches and community centers, and started the dialogue going. So these exercises would include things as simple as inviting someone into a home of another culture.
Okay. And
seeing how they interact and live, and comparing and seeing how many similarities there are. Because even that, the sharing of friends of different cultures, wasn't being done in Canada, as staggering as that seems, because we know so much better now.
All right, I want to get into the letters, the nitty-gritty of the letters. The most scathing words, unfortunately, came from Jean, Vivian's mother. What were some of her arguments against the marriage?
Yes, well, Jean just thought that Vivian was giving away the privilege of her white skin and couldn't believe that she would be that cavalier to want to be abandoned by her community, that she would never fit in anywhere, that no one would ever accept a mixed-race couple, and particularly the children would have no place where they could feel a sense of belonging, because neither group would want a person of mixed race.
Now, it wasn't just your mother, or your grandmother rather. Many relatives almost tried to guilt Vivian by using her father's war career and warnings about future children. Why do you think they thought that could work?
Well, I think they played the father card because Vivian lost her father at age 11 and had a very close relationship with him. I know this because there was a letter that he wrote to her telling her, empowering her, telling her she could do anything in life. Now, he was a war hero as well. Captain Glenn Keeler kept a diary took a photo album, had lots of memorabilia from his time over there, wrote memoirs of the Great War. And the fact that he died as a result of war injuries because having been gassed, he died of tuberculosis in a sanatorium. And Vivian being so young, I think that his memory and influence they felt they could use as a guilt card, but it didn't work because she instinctively knew that Glenn Keeler, her father, would have been an anti-racist.
All right, let's show an example of perhaps the most upsetting a few words to Vivian. This is from a Baptist minister named William Elgie. It reads, "But in consideration of your children, there would be only one step by which you could justify such a marriage. That would be to go to a hospital and have yourself sterilized ahead of time. Put your martyr complex up against that as something to be done next month and see how it stands it. And do not tell anyone that I recommended it. I do not recommend it. I say it would be 1 degree less evil than to bring children of mixed blood into our type of society." Jean had said something similar, but this was a minister. What does it reveal about Canadian society back then?
Well, we can see from that letter how systemically ingrained the racist train of thought was in those days. And that was, for me, the most shocking letter, really the most disturbing of all, because it's hitting at the very point of a union is to have family and to continue on the legacy of generations. And the fact that this was the minister who had baptized her, had signed her autograph book in 1936, and they seemed to have a very close relationship. I think this was as cutting a comment as could have been made. And the fact that it's a man of the cloth, you know, a man of the church, it was pretty. I don't think he ever recanted. Elgie wrote a number of books on Christian thought and moral purpose, etc. And he died in 1971. I don't think I ever saw anything from him apologizing for that.
Did anyone from Billy's side also oppose the marriage?
Well, keeping in mind that part of the book is fiction, but I imagined that my grandmother was not so thrilled. And I know for a fact that my grandfather was in favor of Afrocentric schools. He was not an integrated school guy. He was talked into that position, but initially he believed, as Marcus Garvey did, that the community could do for self and could do a better job of educating the Black community under its own auspices, not blending with the whites.
The couple finally married, and as they began having children, the family started to come around to acceptance. I want to show a photo here showing your grandmother, Jean, with the kids and Billy. There they are. Nice family photo right there. Tell me, how did the reconciliation come about?
When my eldest brother was born, and it all boils down to children, right?
As
Grandma
sometimes
wants
family
to see her
disputes do.
baby.
Yeah.
And she learned of the birth through Vivian's brother. And then she sent Vivian some flannel sheets that she could cut up and make diapers from. So this was the first a sign that things were going to improve. Then my mother took a trip with the two boys a couple of years later. And by the time my older sister was born, Nana had come around. And by the time I was born, it was all water under the bridge. If it hadn't been for these letters, I wouldn't even know.
Nothing at all. Then my next question, what influence did your parents' experience have on you growing up?
Well, obviously, I'm very happy they made the decision they did, and I'm sure all my siblings are too. We've all risen to great, promising careers. We've all had happy lives, and we've been enriched by the fact that we were raised in a non-racist household that enabled us to have all experiences with cultures without that baggage of judgment and ignorance sort of clouding our experience. And I think it also stirred in us this social justice component of wanting to see equal and fair treatment and dignity for all. And, all those principles that make for core, strong human relations were built into our fabric thanks to them. And thanks to my mother's courage for crossing that color line when everybody was telling her not to.
I asked this question completely acknowledging that you have a pin right there that says, "Together we can stop racism." Have we come far enough in racial acceptance since those days of controversy of your parents, or is there a lot more work that needs to be done?
Well, I don't believe we've come far enough. I mean, we've come far enough when we don't have groups complaining about various unfair treatment and just situations that happen to people of color. So I've tried my best to provide tools such as a storybook. I wrote an anti-racist joke book. All the jokes are about a racist. Why is the racist liquor cabinet never properly stocked? No mix. You need the mix. Or why did the racist go to the eye doctor? To get his point of view fixed, right? So I would say, why feel uncomfortable when someone says a racist joke? Tell the racist a joke about a racist. And so, always looking for tools to broaden the dialogue and to simmer down the temperature, and so that the good things can emerge. And that's what I want my book to do, is kind of restart the conversation around race relations. And let's stop punishing ourselves, and let's start doing what my father did, which was he dismantled racism. He did not allow it to affect him. It never held him back. And he used music and his gift of having people sing in harmony together. He could get a room of any number of people singing 4-part harmony in 5 minutes.
I have heard his voice.
And
very beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful thing to have happen, and also demonstrating that harmony, musical harmony and human harmony, are very closely interlinked.
Why is this story important to tell? You've had these letters for quite a while, and you've been working on encouraging your mother as well to write this story. But why is this story important to tell still?
Yes, and I should mention my mother was a big recycler. Zero waste before they even had terms for that. And if I had not done something with these letters, they would have been wasted. And so we couldn't have that. These letters are a testament to attitudes that we are working very strenuously to erase from existence, and I needed those letters to advance that whole cause of we can do a better job of human relations. And let's not even call it race relations. Let's just talk people to people. We weren't raised as a family that viewed society as segments of subgroups. People are people, and we can all get along. And so I wanted this book to elevate that line of thought.
What do you think is the biggest takeaway for people reading this book once they complete it? What do you hope that the big takeaway is?
Racism can be cured. I liken racism to a disease, and I heard a very interesting quote saying that racism is a disease of adults. Let's not use children to pass it on. You see, so what the takeaway is children are our future. Children are innocent and pure, and they don't have racist attitudes. They are learned. So let's get on a track where we start teaching good human relations instead of biased, prejudicial attitudes.
My last question to you, of course, your mother wasn't able to tell this story. What do you think she would think if she saw this book?
Well, the first thing she'd do is get out her red pen and circle all the mistakes, because she was a crackerjack stenographer, right. And any detail that wasn't right, my mother would be there to correct it. She was a great critic that way. Both my parents would be tremendously proud, and I know that their family, their children, that they viewed that as their greatest accomplishment. And so the fact that there's so much progeny in my family. I mean, we didn't even mention George Eliot Clark,
right.
My first cousin once removed, or Senator Donald Oliver, the first black senator elected in Canada, my first cousin, and Tim White, bassist for the Headstones.
I need to join this, ma'am. This is quite a prominent
we welcome you. We do have an honorary category. So I forget what your question actually was.
In terms of
I think they'd be happy about it, and I think they'd be really glad their story was told.
All right, Sheila, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thanks, J.M.
It's
been a blast.
Ontario's capital city was a very different place in 1894, but if you think it was staid or homogeneous and bland, Carolyn Weitzman's new book tells a tale that might challenge that assumption. It is a real whodunit. It's called Clara at the Door with a Revolver: The Scandalous Black Suspect, the Exemplary White Son, and the Murder that Shocked Toronto. And it brings Carolyn Weitzman back to our studio. Great to see you again.
Lovely to see you.
Let's just hit this on the top. This is a true story.
It is. It's way too strange to be fiction.
Well, I was going to say, it's way too strange to be believable, but it actually happened.
It actually happened, and I'm interested to hear what you think is the most strange aspect of the book.
Well, I mean, I almost don't know where to begin. There's 10 different things that could answer that question. But let's start with this. How did you find this story to begin with?
Okay, so 20 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, which was on housing policy in Parkdale, I was looking for examples of people living close by to one another who weren't of the same class, the same background. And I came across a story written in the 1960s about a woman who had been accused of killing her former neighbor, a Black woman, an impoverished woman, a woman who occasionally wore men's clothes, was accused of killing a rich white young man. And I became interested partly for the social history of it and started reading all the newspapers. And then I became quite passionately interested in Clara herself, the accused woman herself.
Had no one told this story before?
You see it every few years in the Toronto Star. There was a story in the Toronto Star last year, and I got very upset and wrote them a note.
Upset about what?
Upset that the same lies have been repeated for 125 years. You see it occasionally on websites. There is one plaque in Toronto I saw, the Adelaide Street York House courthouse, that mentions the infamous acquittal of Clara Ford.
You say you got sort of upset with the Star because they have repeated the same lies that have been told numerous times over the years. Like, for what example?
Clara has been treated as an eccentric or possibly insane woman who had a very good lawyer and thus got away with murder. It's my contention, based on the contemporary reporting, and which also had her testimony almost verbatim, and she was the first woman, second person to testify on her own behalf, that she was eminently sane, she was very smart, she was a performer, she was a person who knew how to use humor to get people on side, that she saved herself, and that she was not, going around shooting people because she was an angry Black woman or because she was prone to violence.
Okay, but is it fair to say if it's 1894 in Toronto and you're a Black woman dressing up as a man and a lesbian, that makes you a bit unusual?
She certainly got the attention of the police because of those factors.
What was life like in the 1890s in this city for Black people?
So in 1861, when Clara was born, a lot of American refugees had come up from the United States, because before the Civil War, there was something called the Fugitive Slave Act, which made people like the person I say is Clara's father come from Illinois, where he was a free man, but ran the risk of being kidnapped. So Toronto in 1861 had about 500 Black people living in what was then a fairly small city, and actually having some influence in political affairs. But by the 1890s, when Clara was on trial, it was again 5,000 Black people within what was now a city of 250,000 instead of, say, 80,000. And it was a completely different atmosphere for Black people. Canada had prided itself on being a temporary haven for those refugees in the years before the Civil War. But by the 1890s, they were seen still as outsiders, as not real Canadians, etc. So actually, attitudes had harshened towards Black people in Toronto and in Canada by the late 19th century.
Mind you, we've had other people on this program during Black History Month who have said there's a reason why the Underground Railroad terminus, one of them, was in Toronto, because relatively speaking, given the times, Toronto was a pretty good place to be Black in North America. That's what I've been told by black historians.
Yeah, and as I say, things change over time, and some things get worse instead of better. So definitely, William Lyon Mackenzie said in the 1830s.
This is the first mayor of Toronto.
The first mayor of Toronto, absolutely. I should have explained that. And the grandfather of William Lyon Mackenzie King. He said that in Toronto, black people can have white people as servants, and that was true. There is at least one case of a barber who had white people working for him. But at the same time, when William Lyon Mackenzie said that, black people could still technically be slaves. It was before 1834, before the British Empire abolished slavery. So it was equivocal.
Okay, we know who Clara Ford is, you've told us. Let's find out about the victim. This is Frank Westwood, who was killed. 18-year-old kid? And what do we know about him?
Well, at that time, he would have been considered a young adult. He'd just graduated from Parkdale High School, which still exists, and he had just started work downtown. He was the son of a wealthy industrialist who made boats and boat accessories, and they lived by the shore on Lake Ontario, where the Gardiner Expressway is now. But then it was a place that they had their own boathouse, and they were Frank was very interested in boats. He was a young, good-looking man, and when he was shot, one of the first thoughts was "cherchez la femme," or there must be a girl in it.
All right, so let's go to the most plausible theory which connects Ford and Westwood. What is it?
So the most plausible theory is that Frank had tried to sexually assault, or had sexually assaulted Clara. When Clara confessed, and Clara did confess when she was arrested by the police, she said that Frank had assaulted her in Parkdale during the summer, and that she had returned in October 6th, in order to exact revenge on Frank. She later retracted her confession. She said she'd been forced into a false confession by the police.
Do you have any evidence that you've uncovered that suggests, yes, in fact, she was coerced to make that confession?
Well, let's put it this way. I argue in the book that she was treated in a way that a white woman wouldn't have been treated at that time. At that time, the police would arrest you. They might ask you a few questions, but essentially they'd put you in jail the very next day. You'd appear before the magistrate. What happened with Clara was that the police first started questioning her at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and it was 11 or 11:30 when she gave the confession. She wasn't given the opportunity to bring in a friend. You wouldn't have been able to bring in a lawyer in those days unless you could pay for one, but she didn't have the opportunity to bring in a friend or family member. The police were very excited when Clara came up. This was 6 weeks after the murder, and they were being mocked for not having a suspect, and they were doing everything they could to create an airtight case, including a confession, and they went too far.
Do you want to describe some of the details around the murder?
He was shot at his front door on a Saturday night after he'd been out with some friends. His mother was home waiting for him. They spoke for a brief period of time, then they turned off the light. Then Frank went downstairs. His mother didn't hear the doorbell ring, but she assumed that the doorbell had rung. He opened the door, she heard a shot, she ran downstairs. Frank lived for a short period after being shot. He said that he'd been shot by a middle-aged, heavy-set man wearing a dark overcoat, wearing a fedora with a mustache. Almost immediately, the attention was paid to Gus Clark, who had been Frank's next-door neighbor, and who was, and again, you couldn't make it up, he was a vibrator salesman by day and a burglar by night. He'd been in jail a couple of times. He was a few years older than Frank. He was 23.
Did he have a motive for killing Frank?
Yes, he had been shot at by Frank's father, Benjamin Westwood, several weeks earlier in an incident over a theft at the boathouse.
Now, what led the police to Clara when obviously Westwood thought, we got somebody dead to rights here, and he's identified this other guy?
Gus was a very fishy fellow, and Gus didn't directly speak to the police, but he did speak to a reporter when he was somewhat in his cups. He was somewhat drunk, and he said, "I don't know why the police are paying any attention to me. There used to be a woman who lived with her mother and 2 children in the back of our house, and she had 2 revolvers, and sometimes dressed in men's clothes, and really didn't like Frank." And then the police went, and they turned their attention to Clara.
Here's how you describe it in the book. You write, Clara was characterized by the media as a monster. And this is an excerpt now from an article in the Globe and Mail. No, excuse me, it wasn't the Globe and Mail yet, it was just the Mail, right?
Yes.
I think so.
Yes.
I think that's right. Here we go. She currently is reported by the Parkdale children to drink a quart of warm blood every morning, going around heavily armed on all occasions with the strength of any 2 or 3 men. Why was she characterized thus?
There were 7 newspapers in Toronto at the time, and they were engaged in a furious circulation war. So in many cases, as I show in the book, they took a story. For instance, Clara being harassed in the streetcar, getting off with 2 men who had been harassing her, and either slapping or hitting one. And the next day, it was like, Clara is known to possess the strength of 2 men. And the day after that, it would be, Clara is a professional boxer. The newspapers were all trying to win this circulation war and using fantastical stories about Clara in order to win that circulation war.
Shall we show a picture here? Sheldon, you want to bring this up here? Let's take a look at this picture. Kellen, if you'd look over at the wall there. Okay, these are supposedly, and for those listening on podcast and can't see it, these are 2 sort of cartoons allegedly depicting Clara Ford. They kind of, I don't know, I guess... You want to describe what the significance of these 2 images is?
Well, the part of the newspaper journalism was that they would take sketches, and these are 2 sketches that are taken of the same woman at the same time. Woman at the left can only be described as mannish, heavy brow, and the woman at the right can only be described as looking much younger and much more feminine. So it really depended on whether you were going to be selling newspapers on the basis that Clara Ford is an innocent victim railroaded by the police, or whether you're going to be selling newspapers saying that Clara is a monster, is a homosexual, is a person who doesn't even need a motive, because why should mad people have motives?
Do I remember this correctly? Maybe I don't. You're going to help me out here. Is this the first time the word homosexual has been used in the popular press in Toronto history?
Well, I looked in a whole bunch of North American newspapers to check that out, and it does appear to be the first use of the term homosexual. So a book by Kraft Ebing had just been published in 1893, just translated using the term homosexual. Clara was being described actually as a what would now be called transgendered, but in other words, uncomfortable within her female body, more closely identifying with being a man. However, the journalist Hector Charlesworth, whose account of the trial became the basis of a lot of the lies told about Clara, was using the term homosexual to describe Clara, and indeed I haven't found an earlier mention in any North American newspaper.
What was the court like during her trial?
Well, packed, first of all. Smelly. Apparently the courtroom was infamous for being smelly. But there were, by the time of her trial, which was in May of 1895, there was a solid group of people who felt that Clara was being railroaded by the police. Sentiment against the police was quite high at the time. So there were a bunch of people who were very passionately wanting to see her convicted. The assumption was that she would be convicted, but there were also some people who were on her side. The trial lasted 4 days, which sounds like a very short period of time, but quite often cases, including capital cases where there could be someone hanged at the end, were decided in a day. And Clara became, as I say, the first person to testify on her own behalf. And she testified for 3.5 hours, and you could hear a pin drop during her testimony.
Where was the trial heard?
The trial was heard in Adelaide Street Courthouse. I was looking at the outside again today. it still exists. And it was, there were a whole bunch of tables in the front and people frantically sketching Clara for this historic event, and a bunch of spectators in the back crowding for a spot.
And what is the Adelaide Courthouse today?
It is a fancy Italian restaurant.
Okay, very good. She have a lawyer?
She had two lawyers. She had the lawyer that she'd picked up when, during her preliminary hearing, who is a fellow named William Murdoch, but he's not the William Murdoch from the Murdoch Mysteries. I want to make that perfectly clear. Okay. And he was sort of a journeyman lawyer. And then she had a lawyer who was much better known, named EFB Johnson, and he was generally credited with her acquittal.
So he did a good job.
He did a good job. She did a good job.
She did a good job. Yeah, her testimony was how significant related to the verdict?
I think that it completely swung the jury. Now, there was this story that I tell about the trial where the police brought in someone who was very clearly perjuring herself to say that Clara was a prostitute and that Frank had picked her up as a prostitute. However, when she questioned, she immediately said, no, the police said that they'd not prosecute me for a prostitution conviction if I did this testimony. So everybody is lying in this book. That's one thing you need to know. But even besides the sort of own goal that the police had in that particular piece of testimony, Clara was able to describe the scene of her arrest and her questioning in a way that preyed on a whole bunch of assumptions about how men should treat women and how police officers should treat suspects that she very cleverly used. She describes being literally sort of pushed into a corner, first in her little room in the rooming house that she lived, then within the police headquarters. She's said that she was told that if she said that she murdered Frank in self-defense because he had tried to assault her, that not only would she never be convicted, but also that she could get a $500 reward offered by the Ontario government. And keeping in mind that the jury, who of course were white men, but they also were working class men, both from Toronto and from areas outside Toronto, such as Markham, that were more agricultural at that time. Some of them had bad run-ins with the police, and some of them perhaps very much sympathized with this notion of this person going about her business. She was a hard worker and being called in by the police and being pushed into a false confession. So she gave the performance of her life.
This case was clearly a big deal back in the day. Question is, how influential do you think it was in terms of dealing with or answering some of the bigger ethical questions around the justice system at the time?
Well, Clara's case was being brought up even to the 1940s around issues of how the police should try to push for confessions or not. But it has to be said that Clara disappears from Toronto not long after the trial. She actually joined the first Black vaudeville troupe as a dancer. And I think the old prejudices of Toronto and some of the hypocrisies of Toronto continued on.
How did Toronto react after she was acquitted?
Well, immediately afterwards, the crowd in the courtroom cheered. She was accompanied back the 4 blocks from Adelaide and Church to Adelaide and York Street, where she lived in the slum then known as the Ward. There was a party in the restaurant at the base of her boarding house. And then, you know, the newspapers who were on her side said, this is a just verdict. And the newspapers who very much were not on her side said, this is a low point for Canadian jurisprudence. And life sort of went on. I don't think that she made huge radical changes. Having said that, the thing that fascinates me about Clara is that we don't know that much about the lives of low-income women, certainly of Black women. And because 7 newspapers were so obsessed with Clara, we know where she lived, we know who she worked for, we even know what she ate. the blood that she perhaps drank. Well, her mother was Scottish. Maybe she was making blood pudding. I don't know, So I think that it's a great opportunity to get a view of Toronto that maybe gives a slightly different view from the way that we generally think of Toronto in the 19th century.
Why do you think journalists and historians have got so many of the facts screwed up over the years?
Well, I guess it's two things. One is this journalist, Hector Charlesworth, who in his memoirs said that he sometimes made up fake news, but sometimes it was true. That is the main account of the case by someone who was actually there. And also because I think that it has taken until now for us to give credence to a woman who, was her wearing men's clothes eccentric, or was it a legitimate way, as she said herself, to feel safer, to have access to jobs that she otherwise wouldn't have had? I think that Clara, in a way, was waiting for a day like today to sort of come into her own as a character who was perhaps a little bit ahead of her time. And of course, there's so many resonances today with controversies about the police, with controversies around believing a woman when she says that she's been sexually assaulted, around the labels that get put on a single mother, because Clara was a single mother. I think that, Clara's time is today.
Just finally, where's she buried?
Oh, I wish I knew. I'm actually going to go after this taping and see where Frank Westwood is buried. But Clara disappeared soon after the trial. I haven't been able to find out what happened to her or to her daughters. But I hope that she has descendants somewhere, and maybe one will show up.
Frank Westwood, I think, is about a 20-minute walk that way, isn't he?
That's why I'm going afterwards.
Okay.
You're welcome to join me.
He's in Mount Pleasant Cemetery,
He's
isn't
in
he?
Mount Pleasant Cemetery,
okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, that's a great title. Did you come up with the title?
No.
Kudos to
my
whoever
wonderful
came.
Publisher, Melissa Pitts, UBC Press. She's done that twice. She's taken a look at a book and she's gone, I've got a killer title for this book.
No pun intended.
No pun intended.
Clara, at the door with a revolver, the scandalous black suspect, the exemplary white son, and the murder that shocked Toronto. Carolyn Weitzman, thanks for coming back to TVO.
Thank you, Steve.
From housing affordability to mounting energy prices, it's no wonder there's a growing interest in off-grid and sustainable living. For the past decade, one Ontario couple has been inspiring others to do just that. Have a look. Nestled amongst farmland and forest near the coast of Lake Erie in Norfolk County sits one of the first earthships to have made contact in southern Ontario. The cosmic-looking structure has been home to Craig and Connie Cook and their two pets for the past decade.
This basically is our gray water system.
An earthship may look like something out of this world, but it actually has a lot to do with planet Earth. Earthship homes are self-sustaining, off-grid structures that channel renewable sources of energy like wind, water, and the sun to power them.
It does everything for itself. It heats itself, it cools itself, it collects all its own drinking water, takes care of its own black water, gray water, and generates its own electricity.
That it's a ship. Takes care of itself like a ship on the ocean, only this is on the land. And it takes care of itself on the land so that you don't have to worry about anything else. You have to be attached to anything, and it's a really nice way to live.
Building their dream home took a lot of research, time, and salvaged tires. Earthship designs are synonymous with using recycled and natural materials. Discarded tires are used to build a retaining wall, which helps create a berm in the rear of the home.
You'll build it on undisturbed ground, and then the tire walls on the back are bermed up. So the dirt is piled up against the back wall. For the first few years, we were just using tires and dirt. So that was the tires. There's 1,200 tires in this house. There's about 400 pounds of dirt in each tire, and they're hand packed. There's no machine to do it. We did 2 tires and had to have a nap. We were done.
Inside, the interior walls are built using a combination of pop cans and concrete, while recycled bottles add a bit of color and intrigue. The Cooks also built an indoor garden that serves 2 purposes.
We have banana trees in the planter, and usually every year we get a bunch of bananas off there, and they're amazing. You have not had bananas until you've had bananas from an earthship. They are the best on the planet. We've had tomatoes growing in here. I've got cucumbers growing right now.
Besides growing plants, the indoor garden also filters and stores gray water, the water left over from washing hands, cooking, and laundry.
And what we did was we dug down below there a big round hole, and we filled it with some stones in there. And then the water comes to here, and then you just use an old-fashioned hand pump. And you can either water the plants with it, or you can take it outside and water plants with it. Or, like I said, I've used that to mix cement with.
Earthships were first developed by architect Michael Reynolds in New Mexico, USA in the 1970s. The main criteria for these self-sustaining homes are straightforward. Use natural and recycled materials, conserve energy, produce water, electricity, and food, and use construction techniques basic enough for the most novice of builders.
The more we read about it, the more convinced we were that this was the way to go. It was just, it ticked off all the environmental things that we liked about it, and just the independence of not having to be, connected to anything that could go away at some point, and then you're without hydro and you're without water and all that kind of stuff. And we never lived in town. We lived out in the country before we built this. But even there, we lost our hydro a lot. And, because you lived out in the country, they didn't bother coming to hook you back up because supposedly you could look after yourself.
The Cooks rely only on Mother Nature. When it comes to powering and heating their home, they depend solely on the sun. Solar panels provide the electricity, and since the walls of the home are made of packed earth and recycled materials, they have what's known as thermal mass, meaning they absorb, store, and release heat. Think of it as a battery. The entire southern side of the earthship is made of glass, which is key to maximizing the amount of sunlight that enters the home.
The house is connected to the ground, so the ground is a constant temperature. So the heat comes in the windows, so it's only going to drop down a certain amount. It can't go below there. So the sun comes in the windows, it heats everything in the house. It heats the floor, it heats all the walls, and it comes in, and the heat literally travels through the house.
Every part of the Cook's design accounts for the airflow that heats and cools their home.
We have a tremendous amount of airflow in here, and the humidity is a little bit higher. It's nice. It's nicer to have, especially in the winter, because people are always complaining about their houses being too dry. We have a lot of venting. The heat rises, vents out through the vents into the upstairs, and then travels as it cools. It comes back down the stairs. So you always have air moving through the house all the time. In the summertime, we open all the windows. We have windows upstairs. When we have the house all open, we have a big hairy dog, and there's hair just flying through the house from all the wind that's going through here.
To further increase airflow, the interior walls stop short of the ceiling.
We have no ceiling in the bathroom. A bathroom fan running for 1 hour will evacuate the total volume of your house. So you heated all the air in your house or cooled it, and it all left out that fan.
The Cook's home is not connected to a municipal water line. Instead, earthships are designed to catch and use water from the local environment.
Our water is rainwater, and it's already soft water, so we don't have to soften the water. We hold in that holding tank a year's worth of water for ourselves. So we need a decent rain once a year. That water comes in, it goes through numerous filters, before it gets used for a washing machine or shower, and then we have it go through a ceramic filter that is for our drinking water.
The cooks estimate they use 23 liters of water a day. That figure is a drop in the bucket compared to the 420 liters of water that the average Toronto household of 2 used in 2020. One of the biggest reasons the cook's water consumption is so low is because the house doesn't need a black water system like traditional houses do.
Composting toilet. This gets us away from having to have a black water treatment outside, a septic system, and it uses no water at all.
Using the same building principles as the main house, Craig and Connie have built a chicken coop that provides eggs all year round, and most recently added a greenhouse.
Growing a whole lot of stuff. Like I said,
we have a massive garden out there that we grow a lot of stuff. It's amazing. People have these food costs. You know, I feel bad for them because they can't afford to eat decent food. And we eat decent food every day. So I like knowing where my food came from.
Craig and Connie estimate they've had over 5,000 people come through their homes over the years to learn about earthships or just out of curiosity. Both have traveled to earthship construction sites across North America to offer their expertise and help. Throughout their own building process, they were met with a lot of skepticism. And since the earthship design was developed in New Mexico, there were a lot of questions about whether it could hold strong against a Canadian climate.
Lots of people said it will not work. And I'm thinking it has to work. We get energy coming in here even on an overcast day. Our solar is bringing in power. So there's still energy available there. Somebody asked us, what are you going to do if the sun doesn't shine? Well, that's the end of the world because there's still sun there. The sun came up every morning and will go down every night.
Connie and Craig retired from their jobs as school custodians to enjoy a life free from the grid. They estimate their earthship cost them about $70,000 and a lot more in sweat equity.
I figure there's about $930,000 in labor. So it's a $1 million build. Everything was done by the two of us. The only thing we didn't do the floor and we didn't put the metal on the roof, but after we watched them do it, we could have done that.
The cooks admit living in an earthship is not for everyone, but it's a lifestyle they've embraced for over a decade, and they hope to keep inspiring others to get on board.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
So the glasses were a hybrid of multiple glasses, so this also could be seen as being Afrofuturistic. It's based on some of the designs of the glasses that he had when he was a lawyer, then when he became an MP, and then when he became Lieutenant Governor, and then later on when he became Chancellor of University of Guelph.
That's tomorrow on the agenda.